So I have 30 minutes to tell you about the rules when it comes to barrier-free and also sealing and waterproofing. Those are 2 things that are going in 2 different directions. So when it comes to situations being barrier-free, there are 0 thresholds, but when it comes to sealing and waterproofing, of course, you do need some specific heights. And of course, that is sort of contradictory. And over the next 30 minutes, I would like to tell you about the sets of rules and regulations that do exist. I also have to tell you that the topic very, very complex and it's very much valid. So it is something that is very difficult to find an overview of. That's due to the fact that, first of all, we have lots of partial requests and we also have some exceptions to these rules. And of course, also the problem that since we have different laws in different states, we also have state specific rules and regulations. So I'm going to look at everything from the standpoint of Baden-Württemberg, and it's mainly about you knowing what it is. So requests that you are going to have to take out your doors and replace them with new ones, or also concerns on the part of selling. Okay, so it's not about what makes sense technically, but also only what's required. And of course, there are solutions that are then also technical. And then on top of that, it being barrier free also mainly depends on how the building is being used, if it's a single family home, if it's a multifamily home, if it's a public building, and also building is dependent on where the building is located, and also which direction is the door going in. Now it works. Okay, so we're gonna get started with barrier free. So it's really about the basic question, what is a barrier free threshold? And the second question would be, when do you have to have a barrier-free threshold? That's not easy to determine. And the question would be, what is that even? That is still pretty easy to answer because there's a definition. There's a norm for that. That's the 18040 in part one. That's a public sector, and part two would be for private homes. And this is how it's defined. So thresholds aren't applicable if they are needed, they can't be higher than 2 centimeters. And of course, we know those 2 centimeters height, and they've been used for decades, and they were sold to be barrier-free. And of course, that is a system solution, a zero solution. And now the question is, what does that mean technically? Needed and necessary. That is something that was clarified as well via the ministry in Baden-Württemberg. And they're saying overall that it's needed means that there can't be any technical system available in the market. So if there's a solution for it, then it's not technically needed. And of course, there are solutions for it. And that's why in these systems, specifically if you're planning a new building, there are really no ways around it. So you have to be barrier-free in this sector. And of course, we're also going to talk about the exceptions that I already mentioned in the beginning. So this is where you can see it. This is an overview of it. This is what it looks like. So we have barrier-free building, and there are some norms that define it. And of course, they've been introduced legally for public buildings, and also part two would be for private homes. And then we also have a differentiation for new buildings and also for renovations. So that would be the same for private homes, and in the norm in and of itself, there are also different sets of rules that are being used and different languages being used when you have to build in a barrier-free way. So you can see in the public sector, if it's a new building, you have to build in a barrier-free way. When it comes to buildings, it is also mandatory. And when it comes to remodeling in the public sector, then it's gonna be and when it comes to private home, it's uh, recommendation. So that would be the official recommendation. If you have to do it, there's no wiggle room, and if it's just that you can do it, there is more of a wiggle room. So what does that mean? Where it is required by law, of course, and also where it is just mandatory. The rule set doesn't know this specific exception. The question is, if we actually plan new buildings, an architect does that, it's possible that there are some exceptions to this rule, and of course, that is something that's then approved. However, very often it's something that we don't even know about. That is a topic that can be a problem. So it is just one consequence, and we actually have to solve it with the planner. So if they require to be barrier free and then says, okay, the 2 centimeter threshold is enough for me for new buildings, and I would then have to solve, okay, these 2 centimeters has that been approved or not? Because if we then put it in and then later it turns out no, it's going to have to be fully barrier free, so a zero threshold, then of course it's going to be a situation where we are going to have a problem. All right, so now we're going to look at living spaces in more detail. There are two paragraphs that determine everything. So it'd be paragraph 35 in Baden-Württemberg, where everything is differentiated in buildings with two or less living units and units with more than two living units. So that'd be starting at three. And that is something that was then successively reduced. It used to be 6 units, then it was 4 units, and now it is 2 living units, just because they wanted to create more barrier-free living space, and the democratic change also played a role in it, etc. So what you see here is that there are no requirements, and for single-family homes and homes with an apartment in it, you don't have to implement any of that. We now have a hybrid solution in the sector, so that means that not everything has to be barrier-free as a standard, but a part of the building. So that affects, for example, the apartments in on a level that has to be barrier-free. So that would be the front door, and that has to be barrier-free. And then you go in the living space, that also has to be barrier-free. And then we end up in the partial areas. So not the whole apartment has to be barrier free, but only living and bedrooms, bathroom, and kitchen, as well as living space. So that means there can be some individual rooms within the apartment that don't have to be barrier free. And one thing that's quite curious and doesn't make a lot of sense would be that the terrace door doesn't have to be barrier free, for example. There are also some exceptions that are defined as well. So, for example, if it's difficult to do that, or if you put on an elevator that's otherwise not necessary, so that would be for existing buildings. So if you already have a different level where you have to build something new, then of course it doesn't have to be barrier free anymore. So that would be an exception. Or very often, let's say it's just a higher building and you have 3 or 4 steps until you even reach the front door, so it doesn't make sense in that case either. So those would be reduced barrier-free requirements, and that would be a multi-family home. There's also paragraph 39, and that is barrier-free machines. And again, they differentiate here as well. So, for example, barrier-free apartments. And in this case, if you really have barrier-free apartments, there are no exceptions anymore, then it's very clear because everything is then barrier free and has to be like that. And then it would also be apartments for people with disabilities, and they are then actually built like that. The problem would be what you see here. Those would be apartment-like use because then we have reduced requirements again that you see here overall. So that's also part of the sector, and those would be, and we differentiate here in a very difficult way because we have old people's home, for example, and they are also included in here. So you can see that we have apartments and then also homes, care homes, etc. So this is just a reduced requirement. This is the full requirement. And what is the main difference? Well, I would say that in this case, the old people really live independently, while we also have care personnel here or carers in general. That's the main difference from these sectors. And in detail, that can be quite critical to figure out which is which. So let's look at all of that using a building. So this is just a classic single family home with a front door and a terrace door. And if we now look at the overview, we see our terrace door that is in red, and then also the front door. In a one single family home, we have standard requirements, and what we do have to take care of is that you have to contractually set the 18040. So if it's in there, it's just included. One thing that can happen, so it could be the multifamily sector. So if the apartment is marketed as being barrier-free, but it's really not, then that could be a problem as well. And there's just this friction that can happen here. So if I compare that with a multifamily home, so I have a very similar situation. I have the front door that is shown here. I have the terrace door and then also the balcony doors. And we also have a multifamily home starting at 3 living units. I have more than 3 specifically, and I also have the front door that needs to be barrier-free, and then also on one level, apartments need to be barrier-free and then also partially usable as barrier-free. And again, it can also be fully barrier-free, and that can also be set as a contract, or we're gonna run into the same problem that I just talked about. So when it comes to this standard solution, this balcony or terrace door are not included. So you can use classic thresholds if you want to. Another exception would be specific width that you need. So for example, 90 and then 205. And as a standard, handles have to be at 85 centimeters in order to be barrier-free. And this minimum standard requirement in line with this law can also be the 105. So when it comes to this front door, if you have a clicker, for example, then it doesn't apply. So it can be at 105. So it would mainly be the front door. So if we now look at the sector that is not private homes, so public buildings instead, then I have paragraph 39. Again, that applies, and I have what is being used here by old people, so there are no exceptions. And again, it's fully barrier free. And I have things like special schools for disabled children, people with disabilities. What problematic would be public buildings, because in this case, you just have a lot of exceptions, and that is really everything else basically in terms of what we have. So will be public buildings, the mayor's office, things like that, churches as well, museums, etc. And that means that we don't have a situation where the whole building has to be barrier free, but really just the main part. And I'm going to explain what that means. So this is an example. For example, you can see a church from my home city. So this entrance is not barrier free. However, this is something that makes sense because back here on the side, there's a ramp going up, and you can just use the side door if you are disabled. So again, the main part has to be barrier free. So the doors have to be barrier free. So that way all citizens can access the building. That doesn't mean that the whole building has to be barrier-free. It just means that the top levels can then be not barrier-free. Because if they only have to go there for the public sector, that needs to be barrier-free. And where there are offices, for example, it doesn't have to be barrier-free fully. So that is easy to remember. Doors, when it comes to public buildings, they're supposed to be barrier-free, and that affects the areas where there's lots of traffic, public traffic. Of course, the same applies as when it comes to private homes. So using this norm makes it where you have higher requirements. So this was just an overview of what's available. So we have personal homes, private homes. There's the one family sector with no requirements, and then also several family homes. You just have to remember that starting at 3 living units, you have to make it where your front door is barrier free. And if you then look at the respective doors, then a part of these ones are also barrier free. Terrace doors, balcony doors don't have to be barrier free unless it was agreed upon before. So those are the areas where we have to have barrier free doors. So if we now look at ceiling, there are two questions. So what kind of normative requirements are there, and also what kind of constructive requirements are made to us window builders? Okay, so the range of norms that are relevant are 18531, that's for balconies and roofs, and 18533 for those that touch the ground, so that would be the terrace or front door. And you also know the rules for flat roofs. So overall, they're asking for similar things. So that means that you have seals for the parts that touch the ground, and then also balconies and roofs. And again, the language that is being used can deviate or be different. And that means that as a standard, those that touch the ground, we really have 150 millimeters that have to be sealed. And then when it comes to door frames, if you can't ensure the 150, then you're gonna have to take further measures. And when it comes to thresholds, door thresholds, you can then also use facades and/or gutters. So if it's 150 millimeter height, then that is the standard. And of course, when it comes to doors, you can reduce it. You can reduce it to 50 millimeters if you also have a water gutter that can be integrated. And if I'm then still below it, so for example, if it's a barrier-free threshold, then it would be a special construction. And in this special case, you just have to discuss it with the planner, the manufacturer of the door, the person mounting, and also the person doing the sealing. Sounds kind of funny, but it is a special construction. So if it's doors where you actually have a walk through, then it's definitely much more difficult. And then it could be down to 50 with respective water gutters, and then there's usually also something like roofing. So let's look at it as, again, the same example. I have my front door, I have my terrace door, my balcony door, and when it comes to doors, balcony doors, the norm is requesting 150, and then also drainage, that's the same size as the door. So there's also a norm for the pieces that touch ground. There are several compensation measures that can be taken, so you don't have to use drainage, but it could also be different options by actually having roofs over the facade, etc. While when it comes to balconies, it is a must. You have to have it. One more thing you have to consider as well are the 150. That is sort of the ceiling height. It's not the height of the threshold, the final threshold, but really just the ceiling height. And it would be the waterproofing height. So this could also be a little roof. So they took the 60-degree rule, so that you have 60-degree right here, then it is supposed to be covered from weather or protected from weather. Okay, so what you see here is another example. This is just what it could look like as a system, and this sample just shows, and technically that makes sense as well. These are materials that are gonna be used that don't have any problem with water or humidity if there's anything going through the threshold. So it wouldn't be wood floors that are gonna get damaged because of that. In reality, I've seen that very rarely, or not at all, to be honest, but technically it definitely makes sense. And what you see here would be the waterproofing height, and then we're at 150 on the side up. And if it's possible, that's what we do. So we have 2 options. Either you're gonna so it could be the roller shutter guide rail, so it needs to be right next to that. That would make sense. Or you are gonna have the roller shutter guide rail that you can take out. Of course, that means that the roller shutter guide rail actually was put in after the fact. So there are also solutions that are a combination as well. So in this case, it would be Yalang without advertising for it, but they actually have this threshold systematic, and they combine that with the ceiling in combination with the drainage system. So they checked into all of that, so it's all in one hand, and everything is solved properly. So I think partially it could actually go there. It could actually make it where something like that is increasing, where you have these combi solutions, so you don't have to think about the whole system. So you are also familiar with this, I am sure. This is probably the lowest 0 threshold. 0 would be actually 0. So even 0 thresholds need some material. So because of the magnetic seal, it works very, very well, and because of that, there's these 2 centimeter thresholds, so that's why it is definitely a lot more expensive. Alright, so another thing that was also included, that is something that came from the Zentralverband der Dachdecker. So this is a planning help for barrier-free thresholds for roof terraces and balconies. So we have learned that this is a special solution. That's how it's described. And the question is, okay, what kind of requirements are there? Okay, so they have to be set up in a way where they also have drainage. So they also have to drain from the outside. And then also the attachment when it comes to door frames is set like this. I already talked about that. It's really about 2 different possibilities when it comes to roller shutter guide rails. Usually there are 2 different systems, so even if it is completely set in, then the material is usually not good enough for the ceiling portion. So either, and of course, there are also wider rails, or it could also be ones that are set on top. So this is what you see here. There could also be this little portion at the bottom because you have the material set up from the seal, so you can just put it on there, and that means that you can unlock it and then put it on top. Technically, that is possible, but in terms of the process, it is more complicated because you have to do it after the fact. So now we're going to look at what they would want in terms of sealing. So one thing you have to imagine is that they want a width of 5 centimeters. So that means if you're in the wall opening, minimum measurement would be 5 in terms of material, and you also need 5 centimeters in your frame profile, so that you actually have everything you need, and that affects the vinyl portion. Of course, there are higher requirements of 10 centimeters for different ceiling types. Another requirement that was made on the part of the ceiling entities because they were worried that water is going to get stuck here and then actually get under the profile and is then going to run after their ceiling portion on the sides. So that's why they want, and that technically makes a lot of sense, they want to make it where the threshold and the underlaying component is sealed as well, is waterproof as well. So there are two solutions. So either you use a hybrid glue, there are also some pre-fixed components that you can use, and that means once it's dry, it's going to be sealed. So from my point of view, what they're trying to do here is, I mean, you have a assembly tolerance, so you would have to go a centimeter out or in, and then you don't actually get to the minimum requirement anymore in terms of size. It's a little bit problematic what in that regard, but other than that, the requirement is the same. So if you are higher than that, you do need the 5 centimeters again. That's the minimum requirement, and that's not in line with the tolerances that we have. So, of course, the seal can't be destroyed or shouldn't be where the drainage portion is, and later it should also not be compromised because of screws or anything like that. So that makes sense. So this is the problem that we have to discuss with them. Does it make sense from our point of view? It's a little bit of an exaggeration. So if you have these areas, we also have the requirements right here that everything that is done here in terms of coupling, it's 150 centimeters on top. And that's why our area is then going to have to have these 5 centimeters being the proper width. And that is also something that we're going to have to discuss with them. It's true that there are some coupling areas. This is just an example of it where it's just not completely sealed, and they also have some requirements for that. So it has to be sealed. So again, we are back at 150 millimeters. The same holds true for the side. As you can see in this picture, there are different systems for drainage. So either you have an open system and then you can drain it right out. That doesn't happen very often though. And then another thing that is relevant would be the draining system that is directly attached. And if you then have a system that is closed, you're going to need a drainage pipe just so that the water is carried out. So either it could be an open system or it could be a closed system. It needs to still get rid of the water. So you can see that a lot of things are changing at the moment, and some things are different when it comes to it being barrier-free and sealed, but it can be solved. It can be solved by talking to each other. That's the main thing, communication. communication, if you have a planner, you need to discuss it with the planner because the planner is the person that is sort of dealing with the height level, etc. And communication with those that do the sealing. And then, of course, you also have to talk to your clients and customers directly. So communication with them is also important. What they want, usually what they want is uh, low setup to be able to walk through a door, and of course, that makes sense as well. And best case scenario would be that there's a corporation with a person doing the sealing just so you can offer it all together. So you just have the best solution. That would be my recommendation.